I am going to do my best to make this very quick because I just want to end by acknowledging the context of Islam in our world today and how we kind of got from there to here. So, Islam from the end of the Golden Age to present. The pre-modern era is the 1258 to the 20th century, right? So modern Islam is really from the 20th century forward, and that is largely dominated by the Ottoman Empire, which leads to decline in other forms of Islamic political power, right? So this is the Ottoman Empire as it grows over time, right? 1300 through, 1683. Then the next thing that ends up happening is European colonialism. And I think it's probably pretty important for us to acknowledge just how much that impacted what happened to Islam afterwards, specifically in the Islamic world. 1492, it's already happening. Portugal is already in parts of Africa. Spain is over here in the Canary Islands off of this coast. And what this means is that there is interaction between European cultures and the Islamic world. This also means that slavery has started, specifically racialized slavery and the enslavement of Black Africans. Slavery was not uncommon in the Muslim world, but it was bound by certain moral and ethical rules. And it was usually tribal, right? So when one tribe defeated another, the defeated tribe would get sold into slavery. But again, there were limits as to how cruel this was, and it wasn't racialized. So Portuguese enslavement of Africans, which was codified and given the blessing by the Pope, that starts in the middle of the 15th century or the 1450s. So that's happening. And then as we go forward, we see the Portuguese kind of sailing all the way down around the Cape of Africa and then landing in other Islamic regions, even as the Ottoman Empire grows into these other Islamic spaces and becomes the primary Islamic power. And then things start to change and more European powers get in on the colonization, most notably France. And though Britain is famous for what it does in India, at the time it is only over here in this sort of Bengali area. And France actually has much more territory on the east coast of the Indian subcontinent. But that is going to change at some point. By 1754, the British Empire has also started expanding in the Western Hemisphere, which is not on our map. But the Ottoman Empire has taken over a large portion of what the Caliphate used to cover insofar as the Mediterranean is concerned. But so far, as long as the Ottoman Empire is in place, you still don't see a lot of European colonization of Islamic spaces. So the Ottoman Empire continues. Now we have British India, like British. You also see the British colonizing this area here in the Horn of Africa. That is an Islamic space. And all of these coastal areas are Islamic spaces now colonized. Then we have massive push towards colonization. And what's important here is that this area over here is now Islamic. By the time we get to 1885, Islam has spread all the way into this region. And so this is a European colonization of an Islamic area. The massive territories of the British are all in Islamic and Hindu areas. And here along the Nile and the edge of Africa, these are all Islamic regions. And we also see France making inroads into Islamic regions in North Africa, right? So at the end of the 19th century, you have lots of European colonization of Islamic spaces. By the time you get to the First World War, you have the partition of Africa. So that's been divvied up amongst the various European powers. You have Britain all along the south end of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as the Indian subcontinent and Sri Lanka, and a little enclave for Portugal there, and Australia and parts of Malaysia and Melanesia, right? Then Oh, don't forget, now the US is in on the colonization. Here we are over here in the Philippines. And then you have right before the outbreak of World War II, so between World War I and World War II, there's not a ton of change. We'll back that up just so you can see. A lot of it is in Africa, where Britain starts to control much more territory. And then here you get the British protectorates in the Middle East, and Australia becomes an independent country. Then we get to post-war, the post-war world. So this is what we're looking at as far as European control of various regions after World War II in the middle of the 20th century, which includes colonization in some of these places that are majority Muslim, right? And especially the Arabian Peninsula, and then along here in Western Africa under the control of France. And then 1974 is really where colonization starts to creep out of our worldview. But this is a major multi-generational trauma to this region and its culture. And it's really important, I think, that we acknowledge the work that colonialism does in changing Islam or influencing the changes that are happening in Islam and why it looks somewhat different today than it did during the Golden Age. So modern Islam is the 20th century to the present. Colonization increased a lot of migration. In particular, you saw not just Europeans coming into Islamic areas, but you did see Arabic and African people now starting to move into Europe in greater numbers. They were already there, but colonization is the primary driver of that massive influx of multicultural migrants, and not just migrants, but refugees, because colonization destabilized these regions. So even in the modern era, where there are a lot of refugees from these same places, let's back that up. Let's look. Right? Migration into Europe is coming primarily from these areas, right? This is where migration from Europe is coming from. So here we have Syria up here, and here we have Tunisia down here. Lots of folks going into France, and here we have Libya. Lots of folks going from there to Italy, right? Let's remind ourselves of what was happening in these regions less than a century ago. In these cases, right? These were colonized spaces. And so the people who are fleeing these regions are coming specifically because these regions are now unstable after colonization came in, displaced the local governments, and then replaced it with sometimes brutal colonial regimes that lasted for centuries. And then we decolonized, which means they left, but in the power vacuum afterwards, a lot of very different and not all of them democratic things happened. This did lead to some increasing secularization, some differentiation between religion and secular authority, but that wasn't exactly a new innovation, given that the caliphate was supposed to be the secular authority and the ulama, the religious authority. But the ulama and their cultural traditions now start to also seem to be creeping into the space of secular rule and stepping over the line. And so you start to see in modern Islam more separation from the cultural traditions that were codified in the ulama in like the 11th century and maybe no longer make sense or apply in the 21st century. You start to see that happening in the 20th century, the modernization of Islam, right? And the bringing it into compatibility with the conditions of modern life, which includes emphasis on the individual conscience. Maybe not to the extent that you see in the European Reformation, though, because Islam is still a communal religion. And then the last thing I really want to make sure that we articulate before we leave our study of Islam and its golden age is the relationship between politics and Islam. One of the reactions to colonization, especially as colonization and colonial power weakens, but continues to maintain its hold through puppet regimes and dictators that are propped up by foreign, i.e. Western powers, is you start to see a reemergence of interest in theocratic Islamic states. And that is a direct result of colonization, because the folks who are in this region, the last time that they were independently ruled by someone nominally from their own culture, let's just say because they're Muslim, right? Ottoman Turks are not necessarily from Arab culture, just like Arab caliphs aren't necessarily from, Central Asia, right? But they all identified as Muslim, and so they could accept the rule of an Islamic state, an Islamic caliphate. And so that is the last model that people in these regions have for a government that represents their own way of life instead of a Western colonial power. And so theocratic Islamic states are a reaction to colonialism and the attempt to de-Islamize these spaces. But Islamic states are not the only response that Muslim majority countries are having to decolonization. Other Muslim countries, particularly ones that don't have interference from neo-colonial powers, are pushing themselves towards liberal democracy. In particular, liberal democracy and rule by consensus is very much in alignment with the teachings of Muhammad and the egalitarian vision that he had for a society. And so there are many Muslim countries that are moving in that direction. And in particular, the events of the Arab Spring, which was a series of large-scale democratic uprisings and protests in majority Muslim countries that spread throughout that region, toppling dictators. The events since then haven't gone as smoothly as you might hope, but certainly these very countries are still right now in the process of organizing on their own behalf and trying to create democratic Islamic states, right? So when we identify Islam only with jihadism, we fundamentally misunderstand the nature of Islam as a religion, its history in this region, and the role that Western colonial powers played in creating jihadism as the present extremist form of Islam that pushes toward an Islamic theocratic government, right? And I want to end by articulating some of what Reza Aslan says about jihad versus jihadism, right? It's the same difference between the word extreme and the word extremism. When we say extreme, it's just an adjective, right? It just means really, really, really whatever. So you can have extremely good and you can have extremely bad. But as soon as you make it an ism, now we know that this refers to an ideology. So Reza Aslan expresses the idea of jihad in that it has two meanings, right? There's a greater jihad and the lesser jihad. And the greater jihad comes from the literal translation of jihad as struggle or a striving or a great effort. And as Aslan says, its primary religious connotation is the struggle of the soul to overcome the sinful obstacles that keep a person from God, right? That is why in the Quran it always says jihad in the way of God, right? You do this struggle in the way of God. However, we also have this other connotation of jihad, which is about the outward struggle for the welfare of humanity. So this is the lesser jihad. So the greater jihad is the inner struggle. The lesser jihad is the outer struggle with the world for the greater good of humanity. And that is any exertion, military or otherwise, against oppression and tyranny. So as Aslan says, war, according to the Quran, is either just or unjust. It's never holy. In fact, the idea of a holy war is something that comes from the Christian Crusaders, not from Islam. And so what we see in the politics of Islam today, jihad is best represented in the popular protests of the Arab Spring than it is in the stereotypical image of Muslim extremists. And this is the thing I want us to make sure we walk away with, that if we had any of those stereotypes about Islam or what jihad is or how Islam relates to the world, if we had any of those stuck in our mind, that from this series on Islam, we can dislodge those stereotypes and replace that, and in the place of those stereotypes, create much better informed images. And most particularly, when we turn to what's happening in the world today and the relationship between Western European and American governments and politics and Middle Eastern governments and politics, we need to acknowledge that they are the way they are, not because of something inherent in Islam, but because of the actions of colonialism, right? And the history of Islam in that region. So I know this was another long series. I appreciate your patience. As a result, I'm gonna trim down the last little bit, and we're gonna kind of coast from here to the end of the semester. So good work, y'all. Thanks for hanging with me.